everyone, welcome to the next episode of my science podcast. Today I'm really grateful to welcome Betti Hartmann, who was a professor of physics at the University of São Paulo and a visiting scientist at the University of Oldenburg, and is now an associate lecturer in the Department of Mathematics at UCL in London. Her research surrounds black holes, cosmic strings, the ADSCFT correspondence, and boson stars. So thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Yeah.
So to start off with, may you give us an overview of your career and why you chose to enter physics as a profession?
Yes, it's that's a very interesting question, because when I started to think about university education, in fact, I wanted to work in renewable energies.
Okay.
So I was very keen on working. I was very environmental interested already, sort of 25 years ago, and at that time it wasn't really possible to study that in Germany. At least it wasn't. Now it's much more common. And so I decided to go to University of Oldenburg, which already had a department in the physics, which was very keen on doing renewable energies. So I sort of thought, okay, I'll just go there, study physics, and then we'll see from there what to do. And so I was really into that until my third or fourth year of study, because in Germany we had 5 years of a physics course, which went directly to the master. And but then I sort of started to have contact with a female professor at the university in Oldenburg, and she was interested in black holes and all of these kind of things. So I remember I went to talk to her about doing a master thesis, and she was telling me, oh yeah, so this is this sort of thing I'm doing, and I was immediately intrigued. And so I sort of started to work with her. I was very interested in that, and then I remember that, so the master thesis was a year, and then I remember that after half a year or something, she said, I think you're good enough to do a PhD. And I was, oh really? You think so? Okay. So that's why I started to do a PhD in theoretical physics, and then I think then it developed from there. So after the PhD, I went to England, to Durham in the north of England, for a postdoc for 2 years, and then I really realized very early on that I wanted to have an independent position. So postdoc is still someone where you're working in a project and you have to follow the project leader and so on. So and I was quite sure that I wanted to do something independent quite quickly, because during my PhD I had a lot of freedom and it worked well for me. So that's why I took on a teaching position in Germany for some time. And that gave me some independence, but then it was a bit difficult to get promoted there and so on. So then I went back onto a research position for 1 year in France, and then came back there, was teaching, and then again it developed that I didn't sort of get promotion, and then I decided, okay, so at that time Brazil was still a very active research active, so we're talking 7-8 years ago or something like that, where Brazil was really developing well, and I had good experiences. I'd been there for a conference, and then I talked to people there and said, look, we would be happy to hire you here. Why don't you try to apply for a professor position? And then I applied and it worked. So I decided to go. And the first few years were fine. But then, of course, the political change came, and it became more dangerous. Funding was cut in Brazil. So, and then all of this stuff happened. And then I decided really that I want to go back to Europe. And it took some time to find a new position. It's not easy. And so I've been a visiting professor for 1.5 years, first in Spain and then in Germany. And then I found a position in London at University College London. So I'm working for them since March now, and I'm not yet physically in London, but I hope to be moving in May. So that's yeah, that's the sort of the track record, more or less. Yeah, that sort of yeah.
Wonderful. So we'll jump straight into the theoretical physics.
Sure.
So how do the holographic theories offer a fresh way to begin constructing a quantum theory of gravity?
Yeah, so I mean, to construct a quantum theory of gravity is the big I think, holy grail of physics, right? So it's people have been working on that since the 80s, 1980. So that's what, 40 years now, and we have not really made that much progress on that, I would say. So it's essentially we know that we have a very good theory of gravity, which is general relativity, which Einstein developed 110 years ago now, nearly. And we understand very well what happens on the quantum level, but we can't mix the two. So people have thought that black holes might be a way to do that, and and then one of the candidates of a quantum theory of gravity was string theory. So string theory essentially takes strings as the fundamental entity of nature, and then you have, just like a wave, you have oscillations on these strings, and you can then identify these oscillations with particle states. That hasn't also gone very far, because you need very, very high energies to be able to really test that, and that's something we can't achieve at the moment terrestrially. Well, not terrestrially. So the ADSCFT, or the holographic principle, is an idea that sort of came up with all of these developments, and it essentially tells you that you have one theory on one side and another theory on another side, and they are completely different in nature, but you describe essentially the same physics. And holographic, because normally these theories are in different space-time dimensions. So normally you have one dimension more on the one side than on the other. So it's just like a hologram. If you think of a hologram, it sort of is a two-dimensional surface that depicts a three-dimensional really situation. And the best example that has come up of this idea is something that sort of relates to string theory, which is probably something we're also going to discuss soon, is the ADSCFT correspondence. And that's the best tested example, and that just comes from string theory. And I think it asks a lot of fundamental questions of what is nature of gravity, because these theories, on the one hand you have gravity, on the other hand you have a theory without gravity. So the question is, if they both describe the same physics, what does gravity really mean? What is space-time? And then one of the theories is classical and the other is quantum. So this is asked all of these questions, and what is the role of dimensions and so on. So I think it gives a possibility to ask more fundamental questions that might lead to spark an idea of what we really need to be doing to find the quantum theory of gravity. But the main point is, it's really a sort of side result from a theory, a string theory, which is a sort of I would still say the best candidate for quantum gravity that we have today. So it's sort of exploring that is interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so
it is.
For our viewers, can you just expand a little bit about what the ADS-CFT correspondence actually is?
Yeah. So as I said, this is a sort of is a side product of string theory, and it deals with sort of how you look at objects in string theory. So it's quite technical, but the idea is essentially that you have a theory of gravity in a given space-time. So I don't know, imagine you have a sort of a sphere, and then you're looking at the sort of physics in the whole volume of the sphere. And then the idea is that if you look just at the theory on the boundary of that sphere, for example, then these two are completely equivalent to each other. So you're dealing with a gravity theory, and then you're looking at the boundary theory in the space-time, and the boundary theory gives you the description of something completely different. And the ADS-CFT in there is, the ADS stands for anti de Sitter. So that's essentially, it's not a sphere, but it's a negatively curved space. So it's just like if you think of a saddle or something like that. So it's something described in that space. And then you go to the boundary of this space, and there you have a theory which we call a conformal field theory. And a conformal field theory is a theory that doesn't depend on the dimension. So if you look at a sort of a thing and you zoom in, then it still looks exactly the same. And these kind of theories are very interesting from a quantum point of view. Yeah, it's essentially, it's an idea of this holographic principle that you have a theory, a gravity theory in a negatively curved space. You look at the boundary of that negatively curved space, and on that boundary you have a theory that describes you completely different physics than the one that you have in the space itself. Yeah, that's essentially the the description of that. Yes, but it's I mean, it's really people use this very loosely now in theoretical physics, sort of saying, okay, I look at gravity in a I don't know, 4-dimensional space, and I'm looking at the 3-dimensional boundary, and I'm checking what happens there. So the ADSCFT correspondence is just one example of the best tested example, I would say, of that.
Okay, wonderful. Is there a possibility of ever producing this in the lab?
Yeah, I mean, that would be fantastic. Yes, I mean, there are a lot of, yeah, because the problem with all of these predictions of quantum theories of gravity is that, as said, you need to go to very high energies to really be able to test this, and terrestrial sort of accelerators or something don't do that. They are not, we are very far from these energies. So the ADSCFT correspondence is a sort of idea that if you use the theory on this boundary that you produce, that you maybe have control over, that you know that you have studied in laboratories or something like that, you might sort of compare this with the gravity theory you have. Because there is, in this ADSCFT, maybe I didn't say that, but in the ADSCFT correspondence, there is also a weak coupling, strong coupling, or low energy, high energy thing there. So what you're doing is normally you're looking at the low energy gravity side. That's something you have completely control over. And the strong coupling, or the high energy side, or the strong coupling, yeah, strong coupling is the better word, the strong coupling on the other theory. And so there might be some possibilities to really test this in the lab. Because the ADSCFT correspondence has been really used for describing some phenomena that we don't really have control over on the gauge field, or on the quantum field theory side, so to say.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so it would be nice. I mean, what you do is essentially you use sort of gravity theories, and then of course every theory you have to test by experiment. So the nice thing would be that you make a prediction and you observe that in the lab.
Yeah.
So that's but yeah, of course, I mean, you need to test, and there is no hope to test it directly. You can only do it via some dualities or something like that. Exactly.
Okay. So how does this allow the study of condensed matter phenomena, such as superconductivity, and using black holes?
Yeah, this is exactly what we were just discussing related to the laboratory. So the in condensed matter, that's what I've been essentially research active in. I don't know so much about the other bit, but the condensed matter stuff I've been working on. So in condensed matter, there is a phenomenon which is called superconductivity. So this is if you have a conductor and that sort of conducts without any resistance. And these materials are well studied in some specific domains, and we understand very well how this happens. But in the 1980s, so I think it was 1985, and then Nobel Prize awarded for that 1986, is high temperature superconductivity. So there are some certain materials which become superconducting at reasonably high temperatures. I mean, we're still talking about minus 250 degrees or something like that, but that for in the lab is not so bad because the superconductors before were close to absolute zero, which is very, very difficult to do. And these are sort of approaching room temperature, if you like. So I mean, the dream of these people is that you can do room temperature superconductivity at one stage, which would be, I mean, would be technically a huge advance, because then we can conduct electrons, or we can conduct currents without resistance. So the for the high temperature superconductors, we have a lot of experimental data, but we don't understand the theory behind it.
Okay.
So in the standard superconductivity, what happens is a mechanism where two electrons bind together, and then they flow together, and sort of that explains superconductivity. the same binding mechanism doesn't work for high superconductors. So the theory you have for this doesn't work for the high superconductivity. So one believes that there's also something happening there. You have two electrons that bind, but they bind via a much stronger mechanism. And so the strong binding is again what I just mentioned. So you have weak strong coupling. So the strong coupling on the one hand could be modeled by black holes on the other. So what you essentially are doing is you're solving equations for black holes in anti de Sitter in a negatively curved space-time. And then you check what happens to these sort of theories on the boundary. And then you model with that these superconducting, these high temperature superconducting materials. And in the other stuff with quantum, I think you wrote this with quantum chromodynamics was the question, right? Condensed matter, superconducting. No, it's just condensed matter. Yeah, there is, and you can also do this with particle physics phenomena, but in condensed matter, that's the idea. So, and the nice thing about this is also that because black holes have a temperature, as we believe, so this famous Hawking temperature that black holes have, so you have also a theory which naturally has a temperature in it. So, which is just a phenomenon that happens at superconductivity. You lower the temperature and then the stuff becomes superconducting. So all the stuff, you can set this up and model it. And some people say that they have success there. I'm not quite sure how far we are with this. But it's an interesting thing, because I personally, for example, got very much, I never really studied condensed matter that deeply in my life. And now I did. So it's very interesting also to sort of see how things are intertwined with each other, and how physically similar situations can be described by completely different things. Definitely. So yeah, it's very beneficial to do that. And of course, that's the hope. I mean, at some stage you make some calculations on the gravity side, and you make predictions for, I don't know, something that happens with superconductors and high temperature superconductivity, and you actually go to measure that. Right? But we are not yet there. So yeah.
No, that's fascinating. So
it is, yeah.
Question is, how can holographic superconductors or superfluids be described quantitatively by hairy black holes and solitons, and what are these to start off with?
Yes, yes. So the idea is that you start with, so in superconductivity, people normally have well, a quantity with which they describe the superconductivity, and that's exactly what I just mentioned, this binding between the electrons. And they just say, okay, so we look at the density of this. So they sort of start to form what they call a condensate in these things. And this is something that you can describe on the gravity side by an extra field that you put into the model. And on the gravity side, this would essentially mean that you have a black hole, and then you lower the Hawking temperature of the black hole. And at some stage, the black hole finds it more preferable to have some additional structure on its horizon.
Okay.
So, and this is what we call the hair. So this could be some, I don't know, different stuff, some fields that you put, some electromagnetic fields, or some so-called scalar fields or something like that. So the black hole sort of goes into a state where it prefers to have some additional fields on its horizon. And the behavior of these fields on the boundary again of the space-time is what describes you the superconductivity. So that's the sort of mechanism that happens there. And for solitons are objects that don't have horizons. So you can think of them as just particle-like objects. And they don't have a temperature associated to them. So there must be something else that drives this sort of building up of this sort of condensate of these bound electrons. And you can model it with that, for example, with the so-called chemical potential, you can model that. And you can also show that then if you change this parameter, then the soliton at some stage finds it more preferable to have some additional structure on its surface. And the behavior of this additional structure on the space-time boundary is then again associated to the superconductivity of the material.
Okay. So my next question is, how did you conclude that the critical temperature becomes very small but stays positive for all values of the Gauss-Bonnet coupling, no matter how strong the back reaction of the space-time is?
Yeah, this is a an interesting question, because this is related to something that one knows in condensed matter theory. In principle, the stuff that we are modeling on the gravity side shouldn't behave like what we are seeing, essentially. So, well, the point is that people, the idea is behind this is that the gravity side is not good enough, essentially, right? So the model is not rich enough on the gravity side. So the idea is that at some stage you would sort of have the temperature going to zero. That's the prediction from the condensed matter side. But the gravity side doesn't show you that. So these Gauss-Bonnet terms that appear are some terms that appear in extensions of the gravity theory and come from string theory, actually. So they are essentially just giving you more information about the gravity field and so on. So the idea of this sort of work that we had was that, okay, if we make the gravity theory richer, maybe then we can match what we expect to happen on the condensed matter side. But unfortunately, we couldn't. So the conclusion that we have drawn is essentially numerical. So what you do is you go to solve these equations that you have with a computer, because you can't solve them on a piece of paper. And then, of course, you can never be 100% sure that you're really reaching the limit. But we did numerical studies, and we sort of saw that the temperature didn't seem to tend to zero. So it was really a numerical experiment, essentially, which we concluded that from. If that's really the end of it, and if you could really go to zero, it's not 100% sure. But all the numerical tests we did sort of gave that conclusion. Exactly.
So moving on slightly here, what are cue balls and how do these relate to your research?
Yeah, so cue balls are sort of hypothetical structures, I would say. And the cue balls have a very nice sort of theory behind them, which is super important, I think, in mathematics and physics, which tells you that if you have a symmetry in a system, so symmetry meaning that if you do some operation to the system, it doesn't change. So for example, if you take a sphere and you rotate it, the sphere remains the sphere. That's an operation. And so if you have symmetries in a system, then you have a conserved charge, which is called the Noether charge. And it's not really a charge. It can be really a charge as you think of electrical charge, but we theoretical physicists call these, could be anything, could also be an angular momentum or something like that. So these cue balls exist in systems where you have a very specific symmetry. And the Q is really the conserved charge that you have in the system that comes from the symmetry. And you can interpret this as, well, if you think of a neutron star, of a white dwarf. So white dwarfs are essentially, we believe, made out of electrons, neutron stars out of neutrons. So you have these individual particles. So you can think of a cue ball made out of some so-called bosonic particles, a different type of particle, which are sort of stuck together. And then in the boson star is really the cue ball, but then gravitating. So you take all of these sort of small bosonic particles, you put them in a sort of system, and then gravity sort of keeps it together. So it's essentially the equivalent of a neutron star, but made out of different types of particles, if you like, that have a little bit different properties than electrons or neutrons, for example.
So that brings me on nicely to my next question, which is, what did you find when studying rotating boson stars in 5 space-time dimensions?
Yes, so the interesting thing about this was that when you are in 4 dimensions, so 4 meaning 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. So you can think of how you can, if you have an object and you want to rotate this object. So you take a sphere and you want to rotate it. Then essentially you have 1 independent plane of rotation, as we call it. So you put an axis and you rotate it around it. And since in physics, it doesn't matter which direction you put it, there is only 1 choice for that. In 5 dimensions, so yeah, and that maybe I should also just say that if you are in 3 spatial dimensions, you rotate something, then it's sort of, as we know also from Earth, the Earth is not really that clear, but it sort of oblates a bit, right? It's not really properly a sphere anymore. It sort of has less symmetry than a sphere. And so in 4 dimensions, if you want to rotate a boson star, it has less symmetry than a sphere. It's sort of a I don't know, it's sort of, yeah, an elliptic sort of object because it oblates. In 5 dimensions, the situation is a little bit different. And now it becomes difficult to visualize, even for me. So you have 4 spatial dimensions, but then you can put 2 orthogonal planes of rotation there. So a object that rotates in 4 dimensions can rotate with 2 different angular momenta in different directions. And of course, then you would also think it has less symmetry. But if you make these 2 angular momenta exactly equal to each other, you can show that you have, again, a sphere, a higher dimensional sphere. But so they rotate in both directions exactly the same, then it sort of stays a sphere. And that enhances the symmetry and makes the system much easier. And so what we did in that paper is we constructed these objects and we showed that they exist. We found these sort of things. And as said, they're back to sort of spherical symmetry because of the property of these 2 angular momenta being exactly equal. So yeah, I'm just trying to think what else we did there. Yeah, we found that properties are very similar to 4 dimensions, but the main point I think about this paper is really to write down a proper model for such an object, and that it was possible to construct it. Again, this was done solving these things on a computer, but yeah, that was the main construction. It has been later on used by other people to construct black holes in 5 dimensions with this type of property with the 2 angular momenta and so on. Oh, wow. So that was, yeah, that was nice. It was nice to find that that solution in 5 dimensions, yes.
Absolutely. So what's the well-known spiraling oscillating behavior of these compact boson stars?
Yes, so boson stars have an interesting property. So when you plot the mass of these objects versus their radius, then their mass increases with radius. So it's a sort of well, it's more or less a sort of straight line. This is very different, for example, to neutron stars. Neutron stars show exactly the opposite behavior. But then what happens with the boson stars is, so you have the mass and then the radius, you increase the radius, and then at some maximal radius, this graph stops. Okay. And then there's a back bending, and then there is the back bending and of this curve and the spiraling of this curve. So if you, as I said, plot mass versus radius, it's not just one line, but you have a sort of spiraling behavior of these things, which is related to, the spiraling is related to how strong you make the density inside the boson star. So along that curve, the density inside the star increases. And this is a typical behavior you see in boson stars, but also in neutron stars. Neutron stars is a little bit more complicated, but it's a very frequent thing you observe when you look at very high density astrophysical objects you couple to gravity.
Okay. So in another paper, you talked about the catastrophe theory. So what is this, and how did you employ this you argued that the branch of the compact boson stars is stable until the maximal value of the mass is reached. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So this is exactly connected to what I just said, that you sort of see this inspiraling. So whenever you construct these solutions, of course, you want to know whether they are stable or not. So would they stay there for a long time, or would they just disintegrate, or what would they do, right? I mean, that's a very crucial and an important question about these type of solutions. And then you can get some information about this using a branch from mathematics, which is catastrophe theory or bifurcation theory or something like that, which was, I think, developed in the 1960s by a French mathematician. And this French mathematician, I think, won the Fields Medal for it, which is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in mathematics. And so what he argued is that when you see a catastrophe in catastrophe theory means that if you have a parameter in the model, so something that you change, for example, the mass or the radius. So if you make a small change and you see a catastrophic change in the system, right? So a sort of example I was thinking of when you asked this question is, so if you think about a sort of rod, and you sort of bend the rod, then normally the rod sort of stays like it is. But then if you apply enough force, then suddenly it breaks. And that's a sudden change in the system. And that also happens then in these sort of these numerical systems that we study, these differential equations that we solve. And this mass radius diagram is exactly a sort of behavior like that. So you have this sort of, it goes just quite nicely, mass, radius, and increases, and then suddenly it changes back.
Okay.
Just a small change in the radius changes the mass drastically. And that's what catastrophe theory thinks about. And the idea is that whenever you have really a sort of sudden change in this behavior, that then the stability of the objects changes. So normally what we do is we say the branch that we sort of know has some stability, then changes to an unstable branch. So in these boson star cases, normally we say that this main branch where you really have an increase of the mass with radius, that's stable, and then all the other ones would be unstable. That's normally the sort of narrative. Of course, you can also go and really study the stability, but that's normally a very, very difficult issue. So normally people invoke these arguments from dynamical systems and catastrophe theory, saying that branch is stable, that is unstable, because we know that at a sudden change of these qualitative features of a system, stability changes. So that's what we normally do there. Yeah.
Okay. So my final.
I think that's a sort of topic by itself to talk about catastrophe theory. There are people who study dynamical systems and evolvement. I don't know, in different types of system use these sort of things. Yeah. So we just borrowed it for us.
A universal thing then.
Yeah, it's a mathematically a quite universal thing. Yeah, there is debate of how far the reach of it is, but in physics, I think we believe that it's a very good tool to get some insight into stability of systems and so on. Yeah,
definitely. So my final question is: you've done work on cosmic strings, so how did you construct solutions for global strings, which are regular on the interval from the origin to the cosmological horizon, if the global string core lies completely inside the horizons? Can you tell us a bit about this and what global strings are?
Yes, sure. Yeah, so the idea of cosmic strings, and here is again how different branches of physics sort of intertwine. The idea of strings came from condensed matter, actually. Okay. So in superconductivity, what you know is that if you have a superconducting material and you put a magnetic field to that, the magnetic field can destroy the superconductivity. But it does this in a very specific way. So what it does is that this magnetic field lines enters the superconductor into very quantized tubes, which the condensed matter physicists call vortices. So it's not like you switch on the magnetic field and the magnetic field is everywhere inside the material. It goes there in sort of small tubes, then destroys, if you increase the magnetic field more, it destroys superconductivity. So the vortices are an idea from condensed matter. And then theoretical physicists who do high energy physics borrowed that idea. So the idea is essentially that you have a system which has a lot of symmetry, and then you switch on some parameters from outside, in that case the magnetic field, and then you get these sort of structures forming there. And that people have applied this to early universe cosmology. So they believe that somewhere in the early universe there were similar mechanisms at play, and you could have formed these sort of tube-like structures somewhere in the universe, and they have called them cosmic strings. So, and cosmic strings are still, people still discuss them nowadays in cosmology to sort of see, in principle, the models that we have for cosmology and field theory tell us that they should have formed, but we have never seen them. So we don't know what's happening actually. So there should be somewhere in the universe, but we have never really observed them and don't know where they are. So there's a puzzle by itself. And so a local string or cosmic string is normally an object, you have a tube, and then it's very localized. So it's sort of, it's really a tube, and you can model it by some field theoretical thing. And it has a very interesting gravitational property. So if you take gravitational field state, what happens is that the space-time around it looks like a cone. So you can think of this as you take a sort of a round flat sheet of paper, you cut out some wedge from it, and you identify the ends. I don't know if I can I can show this. It's something like this, right? So you cut out some wedge and you identify the ends, and then it has some sort of conical structure like this. And that has a lot of very interesting effects you can observe and so on. And it has gravitational lensing associated to this and so on. And the problem with the global string is then, so it's a simpler model for such an object, but the problem with this is that the gravitational field of a global string is ill. It doesn't behave well, essentially. So if you go infinitely far away from the string, essentially this sort of conical thing explodes. So it's not a healthy gravitational field that this thing does. So, and then it has been argued, okay, you never really go infinitely far away in the universe because you always have some sort of structures appearing. So maybe that's not a problem. And so what we did in that paper is we looked at a universe that contains what we call a positive cosmological constant, something that we also believe our universe contains. Mm-hmm. So all observations do that. And the model tells you that you have something like what we call a horizon, so a sort of boundary up to where the universe really is observable. And so that's what we sort of used. And then the idea was to sort of get rid of this illness of the gravitational field of this thing, to restrict the universe to a certain size and put the string into this. And that cured the problem. So so I think it was sort of the idea was to really show that as soon as you really take the idea of a cosmological constant in the universe serious, then you're not dealing with any problems for these global strings anymore, because they are naturally regularized in a sense, if you like.
Okay.
But that's a lot of work. I had to actually check into that because I done that a long time ago. But it's always good to sort of review what we had done there. Yes.
So to finish off, do you have anything else you'd like to talk about? Any of your most recent work?
No, I think we've just really covered a lot of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm just this sort of ADSCFT. I'm working on that still. That still interests me, and I'm at the moment it's a lot of projects that sort of relate to these kind of things. And what's very popular at the moment in gravitational physics is to study extensions of Einstein's gravity, because we have a good handle now to do this, because we observe black holes, we observe gravitational waves, so we can really test gravity theories. Coming back to what we just sort of talked about at the beginning, quantum gravity theories might have extensions away from Einstein. Up until now, we don't have any really hint that something happens, because Einstein's theory is so well confirmed by all the observations we have. It's really crazy. But I mean, this is what people are now really active in, to sort of see if they can predict gravitational wave signals, observations of these black holes by the so-called shadow. I don't know if you've seen that. So that they sort of look at the black holes in the centers of galaxies, which we don't really have that much understanding of as well. So and to make predictions that maybe in the next 10, 20, 30 years we can really test. So it's an exciting time to be a gravitational physicist, I would say. Yeah, with the sort of really research now getting a push. It's really interesting. Yeah, but I mean, what also interests me is really more fundamental question, like why in the ADSCFT correspondence things look so similar if you look in one dimension less or something like that. That sort of, I think, is an intriguing question. Why? What are dimensions? What is all of this space-time and so on, which is something that people don't really have a grip on yet.
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities to explore.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's what makes it. That's why we stay in science, right?
Exactly. So that's everything. So thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you everyone for listening.